Alright guys, we just picked up some cash. It's Friday, May 19th, and we're headed to go play some poker. So, doing this a little bit different for the intro. I want to mix it up for everybody. Hope you guys like it. I'm going to flip the camera around and just show my drive to the poker room. So, here we go. Well, we made it. We're at the casino and we're ready to have a lot of action, a lot of fun, and make some money. Let's go. As soon as I get to Elsinore, a new table starts. I'm on that table and I don't really play any hands the first couple rotations. I'm watching everybody, seeing what's going on until I look down at Queen 10 offsuit and middle position. I make it $18 to go. The cutoff player calls, the small blind player calls, and the big blind player calls. Just the cutoff has position on me. I'm kind of okay with this. When I see the flop come King 9-7, I think it's going to be a good place for me to bet, especially after the small blind and big blind check to me. So I make it 20 to go, knowing that I have some draws I can hit with an 8 or a jack, giving me a strong hand eventually. The cutoff and small blind player both fold, and just the big blind player continues. I kind of get the feeling he is a little bit weak, so I'm definitely trying to bet on the next street. It comes with 4 of spades. Shouldn't really hit either of our ranges. I just make it 30 bucks to go, and this is actually going to get the job done here. The big blind player folds, and I'm going to win my first decent hand. Looking back on the hands, I think I could have raised more than $30 here, but I was definitely watching this player during a couple of the hands, and I know he was really watching me during a couple of the previous hands. And there's a couple times where I thought I could maybe send a bluff out, but just decided to check or fold. And I think this player understood and recognized that, to where he wasn't a non-believer during this hand, and just a small bet was able to get the job done. Against another player and a different kind of a situation, I definitely think a bigger raise was going to be necessary here, but I'm going to take down a $74 profit and move on to the next hand. So this next hand sets a precedent for how the rest of the session is really going to go. I'm in the +1 position. I see a straddle to $6, and when I look down at ace-jack suited, I decide to make it $23 to go. The only player that calls here is going to be the cutoff player until it folds back around to the big blind player, who actually goes all in for about $190 effective. The player who's in the straddle position only had about $40 to start the hand behind, so he just says gamble, gamble, and makes the call, while I actually have to sit here and wonder about my decision whether or not calling is going to be the right one. It's a big raise, to be honest, to go from $23 to $190 effective. There's a good amount of money in the pot already, so he could just be making a move. And I really just planned a short session for myself, so I go ahead and make the call here, and we head out to a run out. I ask the other player if he has a pair already. He tells me no, he doesn't. It makes me feel like I'm going to be up against a hand like ace-king or ace-queen. I don't feel great about that, but when the flop comes out, I actually do end up feeling pretty good about it, because a jack comes out, and next is an ace on the turn and a 10 on the river. So when all of these cards come out, I'm feeling pretty good about my hand. My opponent looks pretty upset. He flips over his hand, and he actually had pocket kings. He did have a pair. He thought he was trapping here, but I ended up getting very lucky and take down a profit of $258. Making these kind of calls on a regular basis is definitely not going to be a profitable move, but Given all the circumstances and the fact that I am vlogging, I felt like it was a good place to call and get some footage and maybe, catch a bluff at the same time. So I definitely enjoyed winning this hand, felt a little bad for my opponent, but that's poker, baby. Let's go to the next hand. Just prior to this hand, I get caught with my hand in the cookie jar. It was a pretty long hand, so I didn't want to include it on this episode. But basically what happens is there's a small raise to $10. The entire table calls. There's another $10 bet on the flop, a $10 bet on the turn, and I make a small bet on the river to try and steal it. It doesn't work. I show king high, and the entire table knows I'm up to no good at this point. But at the start of this hand, the under the gun player limps in for $3. I make it $16 to go from middle position. The cutoff player calls, and the player on the button also makes a call. It folds over to the under the gun player who limped in, and he also makes the call, and we're headed four ways to a flop. Once again, I'm sitting in middle position with actually two players behind me this time, holding a marginal hand. I don't love it. But when the flop comes out queen 5-7, two hearts and one club, I know that I do actually have a pretty strong outlook for my hand. I could hit a straight or maybe a backdoor flush. So as a pre-flop raiser, there's a queen on the board, there's a heart draw. I think it's a good time for me to bet after the under the gun player checks. The cutoff player makes the call pretty quickly. The button player folds, and it folds over to the under the gun player who ends up making the call as well. I know that in this circumstance I'm going to have to bet a little bit bigger here with all the draws on the board. I see a queen come on the turn. So when the under the gun player checks again, I don't think he has a queen. I think he has a drawing hand of hearts or maybe like a small pair. So I'm going to get $45 to go here. The cutoff player folds pretty quickly. And to a sad sound to my ears, I hear all in for less from the under the gun player who actually only had $15 left behind. It's definitely a bummer because I know that I have to hit a draw at this point. The board runs out to another heart. It's a 10. I completely brick, and the under the gun player actually shows pocket fours. I show that all I have is 8 high here, and yet again I'm caught with my hand in the cookie jar. So I lose $51 in this hand and all credibility for future hands. It's really not a great look to get caught bluffing twice, especially when I have a camera in front of me. And I really just hope that I can actually start hitting some big hands at this point, because if I don't, I'm going to be in trouble. My stack diminished a little bit. I'm not feeling great, but in the next hand I look down at ace-king offsuit in the button position with a straddle live. I see two players limp from the middling positions, and this just won't do for me. I've got exactly what I want. I'm on the button. I have a very strong hand and zero credibility, so I make it $28 to go. The small blind player calls. The player in the under the gun straddle position calls, and one of the players who limped from middle position also makes the call. So we're headed four ways to a flop. Not my favorite with a hand like ace-king, but I do have position on everyone, and ace-king is a very strong hand. So when the flop comes out, I get very excited. I know that when it comes ace-high with two hearts, a 10 and an 8, there's tons of draws on this board. I'm definitely always going to be trying to rep a ace here when I bet so big pre-flop. And I have zero credibility, so I make it $65 to go after the action checks to me. And the only player that actually makes a call here is the under the gun straddler. And the 4 of clubs comes out on the turn. And I actually announce a $120 bet quickly before my opponent checks. He says screw it, goes all in for about $200 effective. I snap call, I show ace-king, the 3 of diamonds comes on the river, and my opponent folds pretty quickly. He tells me he had a strong ace, but not as strong as ace-king, and it comes very clear to me that my lack of credibility from the previous hands pays off for a very nice profit of $360 in this hand. For this next hand, I definitely stick my hands in the cookie jar again. I'll let you guys see exactly what happens. I look down at 8-10 of diamonds, a great calling hand. There's a straddle under the gun. The middle position and hijack call $6. I'm in the cutoff position. I also make the call for $6. The player on the button makes the call, and the player in the big blind also makes the call. The straddler is up to no good. It seems pretty obvious to me from the start of the hand, but he makes it $41 to go. He puts $35 on top. I personally know that when the middle position player calls, if I make the call as well, the other players are also going to call. So after a little bit of deliberation, I make it look like I might think about raising for more here, but I just end up making a call. Just as I suspected, as soon as I make the call, the player on the button makes the call, and the player in the big blind also decides to make the call here. So we're headed 5 ways to a flop. I don't think anyone really necessarily loves their hand, but there's such good value in the pot, and I think we all kind of suspect that the player under the gun is bluffing. So when the flop comes out, king high with an 8 and a deuce, 2 spades, the big blind checks, and the player who's in the straddle checks his cards. He really takes his time here. He has a very serious face. He pretty much just looks like he's bluffing all the time here. And he ends up only really putting out a bet of $40, and it's actually just a bet of $40 that was in front of his stack. He really doesn't seem happy about making this bet, but maybe like he had to make it. So the middle position player actually just goes ahead and folds, and I announce a raise to 120. The player on the button folds and the big blind folds real quickly, and I'm pretty confident that this is going to get through here. I definitely can rep sets like deuces or eights, and I could also be trapping with the king of spades and a flush draw kind of a thing. So the player in the straddle position doesn't look happy. His demeanor hasn't changed once during this whole hand, and he actually just ends up tanking and then making the fold here. So with only a pair of eights, I win a pot almost $400. I profit about $218 and a mental win at this point because I know that my read on this player was right. I went with my gut instinct, I pulled the trigger, and I was successful. I personally think that some of the other players might have thought that I was bluffing in this hand just because of my previous credibility, but I don't think anyone had a king or even a flush draw that they could really call on this board. So when all the other players fold, I feel really good about it. I know that I'm definitely going to get value on later streets, which you'll actually get to see take place about 30 minutes after this hand when I wake up with king 9 suited under the gun. King 9 suited, definitely not the best hand to be raising under the gun, but given the dynamics of this table, there's really not a lot of 3-betting going on, so I think it's a good candidate to make a raise here. I make it $15 to go. The middle position +1, they both call. The hijack player calls. The player in the cutoff takes his time, but there's such good value, he also goes ahead and makes the call. And the action folds over to the big blind. He decides to also make the call, and we're now headed 6 ways to a flop. The flop comes out, and it's an absolute dream for me. It comes 9, queen 9. And I am never supposed to have a 9 at this point, raising under the gun. So when the big blind checks to me, I think it's a good board to just bomb on. So I make it $50 to go here. It's a little bit more than half pot. The only player that ends up making the call is the middle position +1 player. The rest of the table actually just ends up folding their hands here. And it gets me a little bit worried because I watched this player limp pocket kings earlier in this session, and he took down a massive pot. So this kind of gives him credibility to have a hand like pocket queens here. There's also going to be hands like ace 9 or queen 9 that are beating me. But the king of hearts comes out on the turn, and I check pretty quickly. I think it's a good candidate to check here if I was holding a hand like ace queen, and especially if I'm worried about a hand like jack 10 that actually just made their straight. So my opponent actually bets out for $175, and it does put me in the tank for quite a little bit because I forget personally that I just boated up with the king on the turn. I'm just like sitting there kind of like starstruck by how big the bet is, but obviously when I check my cards and realize I boated up, I go ahead and make the call here, and we head out to a river. The river comes, it's an 8 of diamonds. It, completes other hands that might have boated up like 8, 9, and doesn't really do anything for the straights that are there. So I just go ahead and go all in here. My opponent calls very quickly. He shows Jack 10 suited for a straight on the turn, and I'm going to take down a massive pot with a profit of $402. So not realizing that I boated up on the turn, I think is a big reason that my opponent felt comfortable putting out that massive bet. I checked it over to him, and I'm kind of curious what you guys think, if checking here is always going to be a good decision, or if you guys think that you might have put out a small blocker bet, or even just a big bet like my opponent did. Drop your answer in the comment section how you would have played this hand. I'd love to hear it, love to discuss it with you guys, if you would have done something different or if you think checking here was the optimal decision. But make sure you do it after watching these next two hands because they're full of action and I promise you won't want to miss them. Strap in everyone, I'm really not kidding when I say this hand is absolutely insane. There's a straddle under the gun, the under the gun +1 calls, the middle position player calls. I'm on the button, I make it 25 to go. The small blind and the big blind, they both call. The straddle player calls and the middle position player calls. So we head out to a flop 6 ways. There's over $100 in the pot already. I had planned to make this my last hand. I had plans after the session and I'm a little bit nerve-wracked because of the fact that it's already a huge pot. I have pocket 9s on the button. I think everybody's trying to double up off of my massive stack at this point, and I end up flopping a set. So the action checks over to me. I think this is a pretty draw-heavy board. Given my raise pre-flop on the button, I don't really think people are going to put me on this set. So I make a pretty big sized bet of $65. With this size bet, I'm really just targeting other players that might have maybe flopped a set of pocket deuces, a hand like Jack Queen suited with a straight and a flush draw, or maybe somebody who's trying to trap here with a hand like Ace 10 with a Ace of Diamonds maybe. But my suspicions are not correct when the small blind actually raises to $195. The rest of the table just ends up folding their hands, and I watched this player make a similar move earlier with a double draw, so I go all in. He snap calls, and we're now headed to a turn in a river with a pot of over $1,000. He shows pocket 10s for a larger set, and I just slide my money in at this point. I feel like I've already lost the hand. You're never really supposed to win when you get flopped set over set. But the board runs out, there's a 5 of diamonds, there's a 7 of diamonds, and I bink a 4-card flush to end up taking down this pot, wrecking this player's world, and actually end up sending him home, which I felt really awful about. The hand earlier where I had Ace-King offsuit, it was the same player. He moved seats pretty shortly before this hand, and he kind of ran up a good little stack, and I end up just taking it all from him in a disgusting pot. Regardless of the outcome of this hand, of what my opponent actually was holding, and how the board actually ran out, I think going all in here is always going to be the move. If my opponent does have a hand like an overpair or some kind of a drawing hand, I would really prefer to get my money all in before, some kind of a scare card comes out. For me or for him, really. If another opponent was in this hand after his re-raise, then they could have easily had a larger diamond that would have taken me out, and going all in on my part would have definitely stopped another player from calling the all in at this point. So I think going all in here is always going to be the best move, but just like the previous hand, if you guys think you would have done anything different, 100% let me know in the comment section. But once again, I will say do it after this next hand because I promise you will not want to miss this one. I mentioned at the start of the previous hand that I would have liked to make pocket 9s my last hand. I wanted to just play my button and get out of there. But because of the amount of time that it actually took me to stack up all of the chips from the last pot and the fact that I didn't tell the dealer to count me out, I ended up getting dealt a few more hands, and as you can see here, I wake up with ace-king offsuit in the hijack position, and there's absolutely zero shot I'm going to be folding this hand. So the action on this hand starts with a straddle under the gun. It folds over to me in the hijack position. I make it $20 to go. The big blind player ends up making the call here, and the under the gun straddler ends up going all in for a total of $72. I think he's just thinking I can double him up before I leave. I want to give him a little bit of protection here, so I make it $124 to go. I'm very okay with doubling this player up or just winning another pot, but the big blind player actually doesn't like my thought process here. He takes his time but ends up making the call for $124. The big blind calling here is almost just music to my ears. I really wanted to push him out because I almost felt bad about taking anyone else's money just before I leave. I kind of hate the idea of a hit and run, but it just is what it is at this point. We're heads up going to a flop with a good chunk of dead money in the middle, and I think at this point my opponent is putting me on either some kind of an overpair or, maybe even just bluffing here. Because as soon as the flop comes out with an ace, a 10, and a 5, he moves all in. I snap call and tell him that I have ace king. He says I'm good, looks at his cards, waits for the board to run out, and then actually ends up showing that he made the move with king queen suited of diamonds. He did not have a flush draw here, but I think he thought that just betting real big on the ace coming out that he would maybe be able to take the dead money from me. His plan does not work, and I end up scooping another pot right before I leave. Now, I really don't love this player's move because he's holding king queen and he's already blocking the likelihood of me having a hand like kings or queens. And the only other hand I'm really going to be making this move with is probably going to be jacks or tens. So really not the best move here, but I appreciate his effort and trying to take a shot and take some dead money.
Okay guys, you saw the cash out. That was absolutely the most insane poker session I've ever played in my life. I speechless. I don't even know what just happened. I'm up 1,800 for the day basically. Yeah, fucking insane. That, I think 1,750 to be exact. I definitely tipped over like $200 to the dealers and the cash out lady. Just, you gotta show the love for the casino and the people that are nice to you and whatever. I mean, oh my god, I got so insanely lucky. The pocket nines hand, we set over set. I run out to a flush. I literally slid the money over to the guy thinking I lost. Have no words for myself right now. Just, I don't even deserve all this, but praise God, baby, let's go. Run good, play better.